I'm Rex Rogosh, and let's clear up trans rights. Supreme Court weighs trans sports ban, raising stakes for LGBTQ plus rights. The U.S. Supreme Court this week heard its first arguments in a major set of cases that could shape the future of trans rights far beyond school sports. Justices considered West Virginia versus BPJ and Little versus Hecox, which challenged state laws banning trans students from participating in school athletics. West Virginia and Idaho are among 27 states that restrict trans youth from playing sports, often citing claims of inherent athletic advantage. Arguing for Idaho, Solicitor General Alan Hurst said the state separates teams based on sex because, he claimed, sex is what matters in sports. He added that it, quote, correlates strongly with countless athletic advantages like size, muscle mass, bone mass, and heart and lung capacity, end quote. Hurst acknowledged there is a discrimination against transgender people, but argued the bans are justified. Liberal justices, however, raised concerns that these laws amount to sex discrimination. Justice Sonia Sotomayor said, quote, there's no question here that a male who identifies as a female is being excluded from a female sport. By its nature, that's a sex classification, end quote. Conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch said determining whether trans people are a protected class is a key issue in the case. The Trump administration argued that states may enforce sex-based rules against biological males who identify as female, pointing to the small number of trans athletes nationwide. The NCAA has said fewer than 10 out of more than 550,000 college athletes are openly trans. Advocates argue that targeting such a small group is unjustifiable. Legal experts warn the court's conservative majority may uphold the bans. The decision is expected in the spring of or early summer of 2026. This ruling could affect trans rights well beyond sports. I mean, we've been saying it for, years now on this. We are talking less than 1% of the population that we're going after. Secondly, as someone who used to play sports back in the day, I can't tell you how many times my ass was kicked by a female, biological female. Like this whole argument that men have a more inherent, upper hand in certain sports or vice versa is not true.
It's BS.
It's 100% BS. I know plenty of biological females who can run circles, shoot, jump, all that over biological men day in and day out.
I mean, one of the most famous case, that's the one that Leah Thomas, the trans swimmer who ended up finishing 5th with a cis woman who's now a major TERF and major anti-trans campaigner. She finished 5th. Correct. That means that 4 cisgender biological born women beat her. Leah Thomas. Right. And also, every time we talk about trans ban, especially on the conservative side, they only talk about trans women. It is almost somehow that trans men doesn't get in on their radar.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say is, even what we just said, we're talking about trans women, and we forget that there are trans men. So they're just saying, well, we don't care. It almost is like, well, they're
inherently inferior.
They're inherently inferior, exactly, because they used to be women. It's just their arguments are so unfounded, and then we have to talk about again, this is a slippery slope. So this happens, and then if we're talking about college sports, but then we go into high school sports and middle school sports and elementary school sport. Like we can keep going. So where does all that and then what do we start classifying as female sports, and what do we classify as men's sports? Because I remember in high school I interrupted my high school because I was the first person to try out for the cheerleading squad as a male. And I went in as a mascot. And that pissed off a lot of people because it was supposedly a female sport. But I thought to myself, well, there's college gymnasts who
tons of male cheerleaders.
Sure, but in my high school, cheerleading was a female sport.
Right.
George W. Bush was, can we talk about this? George W. Bush was a college cheerleader.
a lot of our presidents were.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was a lousy president.
Yes.
But, I think that there's some serious things to discuss here, which is like, one, it's such an absurd thing. You were talking about like being in a women's, allegedly women's sport. A friend of mine I was chatting to about this, she lives in Ohio. She's talking about her niece. Her niece recently, like a couple of years ago, she was doing wrestling, but men's wrestling, because there were no other girls. So like,
right.
I haven't seen any Supreme Court cases about this girl doing men's wrestling. Is she not trained? Like, why are cis people allowed to be in another gender, like, thing, but also like we have to remember there's two things going on with these cases. One is the transphobia, but we've not talked a lot about how this is an attempt to sexually assault cis women, and I do mean that very seriously. When you look at how do they determine who is and isn't cis, they've been pushing laws and they've been pushing different sports criteria to require the examining of underage girls, and this is disgusting. It comes off very pedophilic, and it is the right trying to attack cis kids and trans kids trying to do this. They are the problem, and we need to start calling that crisis out for what it is. It's a child abuse crisis that the right's trying to start.
They're not even, they're targeting cis women too. I mean, remember the Algerian runner or swimmer?
Exactly.
Yeah, she won, but now, and suddenly the right wing is like, she is trans.
Right.
Without actually examine her, and they want to now do
without
that
providing any kind of evidence.
Which again is really, it's offensive. This examinations.
It is sexual assault that they're advocating for on all kids.
And the numbers are important again to say.
Yes.
10 out of more than 550,000. That's, the numbers are crazy. And it bears repeating also that targeting such a small group is unjustifiable.
Well, and unfortunately, that's how many that we know, because there's so many that are,
in the closet.
In the closet, we'll say. But, you brought up a good point. There are plenty of small towns out there where, little Betty wants to play football, or little Betty wants to go wrestling, and they don't have that because they're in a town of 100, right? So
do they exclude the person, or do they let the person
play?
Yeah,
and with laws like this, she would be excluded.
Right.
Regardless, she's not trans, but she would be excluded.
And also there are, actually, I wanted to go back to the case and talk about how likely this will end up anywhere. I mean, to be honest with you, this one probably most likely going to lean on Roberts, because Gorsuch already said that sex discrimination, including trans, in his Bostock ruling, which means that unless he wants to trash his own legacy in his own ruling, he's not turning back that one.
Right.
So I mean, obviously the other four are most likely lost causes. I mean, we're talking about Alito and Thomas at the very least. They would squash anything related to LGBTQ rights. Not sure if Barrett or Kavanaugh would do such a thing. But Gorsuch is probably looking at his own legacy and like, well, I can't do that. You've already said that trans is, a sex characteristic. So,
on the one hand, that's a very smart observation. On the other hand, I don't think one should put much faith in this court and any hope.
Fair enough.
Yes. I mean, they flip-flop like a slinky. So,
well, like a dying eel.
Yes. There is no other queer nonprofit media platform like this in the entire world. Support our LGBTQ stories by sharing them and subscribing to Queer News Tonight.